The billionaire watched the black maid comfort his autistic son, and something in him changed. Watch what happens when a billionaire discovers he's been completely wrong about everything that matters. Charles Whitmore stood frozen in his penthouse doorway, tears streaming down his face as he watched something impossible unfold before his eyes. His 8-year-old autistic son Oliver, who hadn't spoken a word in months, was sitting peacefully in the arms of Grace Williams, the woman he'd hired to clean his floors. She was humming a gentle melody, and for the first time in years, Oliver wasn't screaming. He'd fired 17 caregivers in 2 years. Specialists, therapists, experts with degrees from Harvard and Yale. But this woman, this maid from Brooklyn, had done what no one else could do. She had reached his son. What Charles witnessed in that moment would shatter everything he thought he knew about love, family, and what it really means to be a father. This is the story of how one woman's compassion transformed not just an autistic child, but the heart of a man who had forgotten how to feel. And trust me, what happens next will change how you see the world forever. Welcome to Touching Black Stories channel. Every story we share is more than just drama. It's a reminder of strength, resilience, and justice. If you believe in celebrating Black excellence and standing against injustice and prejudice, hit that like and subscribe button right now. We would like to know where you are watching from and what time is it for you right now in the comment. Charles Whitmore at 42 years old could buy entire city blocks with pocket change, who had revolutionized artificial intelligence and built a tech empire worth $12 billion. His Manhattan penthouse stretched across an entire floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. Everything was white marble, chrome, and glass. Perfect. Cold. Sterile. Just like the man who lived there. Charles had lost his father when he was only 8 years old, the same age his son Oliver is now. His mother, drowning in grief, had essentially abandoned him emotionally. So Charles learned early that the only thing you could count on in life was success. Money meant security. Achievement meant worth. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, and vulnerability was a weakness that could destroy everything he'd built. When Oliver was born 8 years ago, Charles thought fatherhood would be like running a company. You identify problems, implement solutions, measure results. But autism doesn't follow business logic. Oliver lived in a world of overwhelming sensations where a simple touch could feel like fire, where unexpected sounds could trigger hours of inconsolable screaming, where words seemed trapped behind invisible walls. Charles had tried everything. He'd hired the most expensive specialists, the most qualified caregivers, the most advanced therapists. 17 different people in 2 years. Some lasted weeks, others barely made it through a single day. Oliver would have meltdowns that could last for hours, throwing himself against walls, breaking anything within reach, his little body racked with a pain that Charles couldn't understand and couldn't fix. The divorce from Sarah had been brutal. She'd accused Charles of caring more about his stock portfolio than their son's well-being. Maybe she was right. When Oliver would have his episodes, Charles felt something dark and terrible rising in his chest. Not anger at his son, but a helpless rage at his own inadequacy. Here was a man who could solve complex algorithms and predict market trends, but he couldn't comfort his own child. That's when Grace Williams entered their lives, though not in the way you might expect. Charles had hired her through an agency, not as a caregiver but as a housekeeper. At 35, Grace carried herself with a quiet dignity that came from surviving life's hardest lessons. She was a single mother from Crown Heights, Brooklyn, working 3 jobs to support her 12-year-old daughter Zoe's dreams of attending college. Grace had been a teacher once, working with special needs children in an inner-city school. But when budget cuts eliminated her position, she'd been forced into cleaning offices at night, housekeeping during the day, and tutoring on weekends. Every dollar she earned went toward Zoe's future. Grace herself had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes, never knowing stability. She was determined that Zoe would have every opportunity she'd been denied. The first day Grace walked into the Whitmore penthouse, she noticed something the 17 previous caregivers had missed. Oliver wasn't just having random meltdowns. There was a pattern. The episodes intensified when the apartment got too quiet, when the routine changed, when he felt overwhelmed by too much space and too little connection. Grace recognized the signs because she'd worked with dozens of children like Oliver. She understood that his behaviors weren't defiance or manipulation, they were communication. On her third day cleaning the penthouse, Grace was vacuuming the living room when she heard it. A sound that made her blood run cold. It was Oliver, screaming with the kind of desperation that spoke of deep, primal terror. Charles was in his home office on a conference call with investors in Tokyo, completely absorbed in quarterly projections while his son fell apart in the next room. Grace found Oliver in his bedroom, having thrown every book off his shelves, his little fists bloody from pounding the walls. His face was red and streaked with tears, his whole body trembling with exhaustion and overstimulation. Without thinking, Grace knelt down and began humming a simple melody, something her own foster mother had sung to her during the darkest nights of her childhood. Something magical happened. Oliver's screaming slowly subsided to quiet sobs. Grace didn't try to touch him or speak to him. She just hummed, creating a gentle sound barrier between him and the overwhelming world. After 20 minutes, Oliver crawled into her lap and fell asleep. That's when Charles found them. He'd finished his call and come looking for his son, expecting to find the usual aftermath of destruction. Instead, he found peace. Oliver sleeping peacefully in the arms of the woman he'd hired to clean his floors. Charles felt something crack open in his chest, something he'd kept locked away for years. For the first time since Oliver was born, he saw his son not as a problem to be solved, but as a little boy who just needed to be understood. But Charles's first instinct wasn't gratitude. It was suspicious. Grace was overstepping her boundaries. He was paying her to clean, not to parent his child. He told himself that accepting help meant admitting failure, and Charles Whitmore didn't fail at anything. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt completely overwhelmed by life's challenges, hit that subscribe button right now because this journey is just beginning, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Have you ever been in a situation where pride kept you from accepting help that could change everything? Let me know in the comments below. Over the next 2 weeks, something unprecedented began happening in the Whitmore penthouse. Oliver started seeking out Grace during his difficult moments. It wasn't planned or scheduled like his therapy sessions. It was natural, instinctive. When the world became too loud or too bright or too much, Oliver would find Grace wherever she was working and simply stand nearby. She would acknowledge him with a gentle nod, never overwhelming him with forced interaction, just letting him know he was safe. Grace began incorporating subtle changes into her cleaning routine. She noticed that Oliver calmed down when she hummed, so she hummed while she worked. She observed that he loved patterns, so she arranged his books and toys in specific sequences that pleased him. She discovered that he responded to rhythm, so she would tap gentle beats on surfaces as she cleaned, creating a soothing musical backdrop to his day. Charles watched all of this through the security cameras in his home office. He told himself he was just monitoring the situation, ensuring his son's safety. But the truth was more complicated. He was fascinated by what he was witnessing. Grace never raised her voice, never showed frustration, never treated Oliver like a burden or a problem to be managed. She treated him like a person worthy of respect and understanding. The transformation in Oliver was undeniable. His meltdowns became less frequent and less intense. He started making eye contact with Grace, something he rarely did with anyone else. He began showing her his favorite things, his books about space and dinosaurs, his collection of smooth stones that he loved to arrange in perfect lines. But it was during Oliver's music time that the real breakthrough happened. Grace had noticed that Oliver loved the rhythm of her humming, so she started singing softly while she worked. One afternoon, while she was dusting the piano in the living room, Oliver approached with his tablet. On the screen was a video of someone playing piano. He looked at Grace, then at the piano, then back at Grace. Grace understood. She sat down at the piano bench and began playing a simple melody. Oliver's face lit up with wonder. He climbed onto the bench beside her and placed his small fingers on the keys. Grace guided his hands, showing him how to create harmony. For 45 minutes, they made music together. No words were needed. They communicated through rhythm and melody, creating something beautiful in the silence. Charles watched from his office doorway, hidden from view. He had bought that piano 3 years ago, thinking music lessons might help Oliver. But every professional instructor had given up within weeks, frustrated by Oliver's inability to follow traditional teaching methods. Grace hadn't tried to teach Oliver piano. She had simply made music with him. That evening, after Grace had gone home, Charles tried to recreate the moment. He sat at the piano and played the same melody he'd heard Grace playing. Oliver approached, just as he had with Grace, but when Charles tried to guide his hands, Oliver pulled away. The magic was gone. It wasn't about the piano or the music. It was about Grace herself, about the way she saw Oliver not as a collection of symptoms to be managed, but as a whole person with his own unique way of experiencing the world. 3 weeks into this new routine, Charles's ex-wife Sarah made an unannounced visit. Sarah was a corporate lawyer, sharp and ambitious, who had never fully understood Oliver's needs. She walked into the penthouse expecting to find chaos, as she usually did. Instead, she found Oliver sitting quietly with Grace, working on a puzzle while she softly sang a lullaby. Sarah's reaction was immediate and harsh. She pulled Charles aside and demanded to know why the maid was acting as Oliver's caregiver. She accused Charles of being irresponsible, of exposing Oliver to someone without proper credentials or background checks. She threatened to petition for full custody if Charles didn't immediately establish proper boundaries. Charles felt trapped between two worlds. He could see how much Oliver had improved with Grace's presence, but Sarah's threats triggered his deepest fears. Losing Oliver would destroy him, but admitting that a housekeeper had succeeded where all the experts had failed felt like acknowledging his own complete failure as a father. Meanwhile, Grace was fighting her own battles. Every evening, she returned to her small apartment in Brooklyn to help her daughter Zoe with homework and college applications. Zoe was brilliant, just like her mother, but dreams required money that Grace didn't have. Zoe had been accepted to a prestigious summer program for gifted students, but the cost was $3,000. Grace was already working 16-hour days between her 3 jobs. There was no more time to sell, no more energy to give. Grace never complained about her exhaustion. She never mentioned her financial struggles to Charles or anyone else. But the stress was taking its toll. She would sometimes fall asleep on the subway ride home, missing her stop because her body simply couldn't stay awake any longer. One evening, Zoe found her mother crying quietly at their kitchen table, surrounded by bills and college brochures. Zoe was 12, but she was old enough to understand that her dreams were becoming her mother's nightmare. She told Grace that she didn't need college, that she could get a job and help support them both. Grace's heart broke. She was working herself to exhaustion to give Zoe opportunities, but all Zoe could see was her mother's pain. This is when fate decided to test everyone involved. Charles had an emergency board meeting scheduled with investors from Singapore. The meeting had been postponed twice already, and billions of dollars hung in the balance. It was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon, during Oliver's most difficult time of day. The transition from lunch to afternoon activities often triggered his most severe episodes. Charles arranged for Oliver's regular afternoon caregiver to come early, but an hour before the meeting, she called in sick. Charles panicked. He called the agency, but no one else was available on such short notice. The meeting couldn't be postponed again without risking the entire deal. Grace wasn't scheduled to work that day, but Charles called her in desperation. He offered to pay her double her usual rate if she could come immediately. Grace was at her second job, cleaning an office building in Manhattan, but she heard the panic in Charles's voice. She told her supervisor she had a family emergency and caught the first subway train to the Upper East Side. Grace arrived just as Charles was starting his video conference. Oliver was already showing signs of distress, pacing in circles and making the repetitive vocal sounds that usually preceded a major meltdown. Grace quickly assessed the situation and began implementing her calming strategies. She dimmed the lights, put on soft music, and started humming Oliver's favorite melody. For 2 hours, while Charles negotiated a deal worth $400 million, Grace kept Oliver calm and happy. She played piano with him, did puzzles, and even taught him a simple card game. Oliver was so engaged and content that he barely noticed his father was in the house. When Charles finished his meeting, he found Grace and Oliver in the living room, building an elaborate tower out of blocks. Oliver was actually giggling, a sound Charles heard so rarely that it made his throat tight with emotion. The deal had been successful, but Charles realized that the real miracle had happened in his living room. That evening, Sarah called Charles with an ultimatum. She had spoken to her lawyer and was prepared to file for emergency custody. She accused Charles of endangering Oliver by allowing unqualified staff to provide childcare. She demanded that Charles fire Grace immediately and hire a certified autism specialist, or she would see him in court within the week. Charles felt the walls closing in around him. Everything he had built, everything he thought he understood about control and success, was crumbling. He had to choose between his business reputation and his son's happiness, between following the rules and following his heart. If you're feeling the tension building in this story, make sure you're subscribed because what happens next will shock you. The decision Charles makes will change everything. Have you ever been forced to choose between what looks right and what feels right? Share your experience in the comments. The conversation that would destroy everything happened on a Wednesday morning. Charles sat in his home office, staring at his phone for 20 minutes before finally dialing Grace's number. When she answered, her voice was warm and cheerful, completely unaware of what was coming. Charles's voice was cold and professional, the same tone he used when firing underperforming employees. He told Grace that effective immediately, her services would no longer be needed. He said there had been some confusion about her role in the household, and that they would be returning to a more traditional arrangement with qualified childcare professionals. Grace was silent for a long moment. Then she asked if this was about what had happened the day before, if she had done something wrong with Oliver. Charles couldn't bring himself to explain about Sarah's threats or the custody battle. Instead, he said that boundaries had been crossed and that it was inappropriate for household staff to become involved in childcare. Grace's voice became very quiet. She said she understood and asked when she should return her keys. Charles told her to leave them with the doorman. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. 17 years of experience had taught Charles how to terminate business relationships efficiently. But this wasn't business, and Grace wasn't just an employee. Grace hung up the phone and sat in her small kitchen, staring at the wall. Zoe was at school, so Grace was alone with the weight of what had just happened. She thought about Oliver's smile when they played piano together. She thought about the way he would seek her out when the world became too overwhelming. She thought about the trust in his eyes when he fell asleep in her arms. But more than anything, she thought about the look on Charles's face when he watched them together. She had seen something crack open in that man, some long-buried capacity for love and wonder. Grace realized that losing her job was devastating not just because of the money, but because she was being forced to abandon a little boy who needed her. Oliver didn't understand why Grace stopped coming. Children with autism struggle with unexpected changes, and Oliver's routine had become built around Grace's presence. The new caregiver that Charles hired was perfectly qualified, a certified autism specialist with impressive credentials and a no-nonsense approach to behavioral management. But Oliver wasn't a behavior to be managed. He was a child who had formed an attachment, who had learned to trust, who had discovered a way to communicate with the world through music and gentle understanding. The new caregiver treated his attempts to seek comfort as attention-seeking behavior. She redirected his stymieing behaviors instead of understanding their function. She maintained appropriate professional boundaries instead of offering the human connection that Oliver craved. Within 3 days, Oliver regressed to behaviors Charles hadn't seen in months. The screaming returned, longer and more intense than before. Oliver stopped eating regular meals, accepting only crackers and milk. He wouldn't sleep through the night, waking up crying and searching through the apartment as if looking for someone who was no longer there. Charles threw himself into work with manic intensity, staying at the office until midnight, taking calls at 5 a.m, traveling to meetings he could have handled by video conference. He told himself this was necessary, that he was protecting his business and securing Oliver's future. But the truth was that he couldn't bear to be in the apartment, couldn't face the evidence of what his decision had cost his son. Grace, meanwhile, was struggling to survive. Losing the Whitmore job meant losing her highest-paying position. She found work cleaning office buildings at night, but the pay was significantly less and the hours were brutal. She would work from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, then rush home to get Zoe ready for school, then report to her day job cleaning private homes. The exhaustion was overwhelming, but worse was the emotional toll. Grace found herself thinking about Oliver constantly, wondering if he was okay, if he was eating, if anyone was singing to him when the world became too loud. She had worked with many children over the years, but Oliver had touched something deep in her heart. Leaving him felt like abandoning her own child. Zoe noticed the change in her mother immediately. Grace tried to hide her exhaustion and sadness, but 12-year-old Zoe was perceptive. She could see her mother moving like a sleepwalker, could hear her crying softly in the bathroom when she thought Zoe was asleep. Zoe started doing more around the apartment, cooking simple meals and doing her own laundry, trying to ease her mother's burden in any way she could. 2 weeks after Grace's termination, the crisis that everyone had been unconsciously dreading finally arrived. Charles was in his office on a Saturday afternoon, trying to catch up on work while Oliver played in his room. The new caregiver was off for the weekend, and Charles had convinced himself that he could handle one afternoon alone with his son. Oliver had been unusually quiet, which Charles took as a good sign. But when he went to check on him, he found Oliver in the bathroom, having used scissors to cut his own arms. Not deep enough to cause serious injury, but deep enough to draw blood. Oliver was sitting on the bathroom floor, staring at the red marks on his skin with a mixture of fascination and confusion. Charles's world exploded. He rushed Oliver to the emergency room, his hands shaking as he tried to explain to the doctors what had happened. The medical team was professional and compassionate, treating Oliver's wounds and assessing his mental state. But their questions felt like accusations to Charles. Was there a history of self-harm? Have there been any recent changes in routine or caregiving? Was the child receiving appropriate therapeutic support? Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the attending psychiatrist, was gentle but direct. She explained that self-harm in autistic children often occurs during periods of severe emotional distress or major disruptions in attachment. She asked about Oliver's support system, about who provided his primary care and emotional regulation assistance. Charles broke down and told her everything. About Grace, about the connection they had formed, about the custody threats that had forced him to terminate her employment. Dr. Martinez listened without judgment, but her expression grew increasingly concerned. She explained that Oliver had formed what psychologists call a secure attachment with Grace. For a child with autism, who struggles to form social connections, such attachments are rare and precious. Severing that connection abruptly, without explanation or transition, could cause genuine trauma. Oliver's self-harm wasn't random or manipulative. It was his way of expressing emotional pain that he couldn't put into words. Sitting in that sterile hospital room, watching his son sleep with bandages on his small arms, Charles finally understood the magnitude of what he had done. He had chosen reputation over relationship, control over connection. He had protected his business interests while destroying the one thing that had brought his son peace. Grace learned about the hospitalization through mutual contact at the staffing agency. Without hesitation, she called out sick from her night job and took a taxi to the hospital. She didn't care about professional boundaries or appropriate roles. A child she loved was in pain, and nothing else mattered. Charles was in the hospital cafeteria when Grace arrived, sitting alone with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, staring at nothing. Grace sat down across from him without saying a word. For several minutes, they sat in silence, two people who had been forced apart by circumstances beyond their control, united now by their shared love for a little boy who was fighting battles they couldn't fully understand. Finally, Charles looked up and met Grace's eyes. What she saw there wasn't the cold, controlling billionaire who had fired her over the phone. She saw a broken father who had lost his way, a man who had been so afraid of appearing weak that he had forgotten how to be strong. Charles's voice was barely a whisper when he spoke. He told Grace that he didn't know how to be a father, that every decision he made seemed to hurt Oliver more. He said that watching Oliver with Grace had shown him what love was supposed to look like, but that he was too scared and too proud to admit he needed help. Grace reached across the table and took Charles's hand. She told him that love wasn't about having all the answers or being perfect. Love was about showing up, about being present, about learning to see the world through someone else's eyes. She said that Oliver didn't need a perfect father. He just needed a father who was willing to try, to fail, to learn, and to keep trying. That conversation in the hospital cafeteria changed everything, but not in the way you might expect. Because the hardest part of this story wasn't the crisis. It was what came next. Make sure you're subscribed because the transformation that's about to happen will restore your faith in the power of human connection. Can you believe that pride and fear almost destroyed the most important relationship in this father's life? Have you ever let fear stop you from doing what you knew was right? The drive back to the penthouse was silent, but it wasn't the cold, empty silence that had defined Charles's life for so long. Oliver sat between Charles and Grace in the back seat of the car, his small hand holding Grace's while his head rested against his father's shoulder. It was the first time in weeks that Oliver seemed peaceful, and both adults were afraid to speak, afraid to break the fragile spell of connection. Dr. Martinez had been clear about what needed to happen next. Oliver required stability, consistency, and most importantly, the people who understood him needed to work together, not against each other. She had given them a list of family therapists who specialized in autism and attachment and had scheduled follow-up appointments to monitor Oliver's emotional recovery. But the real healing began that first evening back home. Charles had asked Grace to stay for dinner, and she had accepted, though both of them were uncertain about what this new arrangement would look like. As Grace prepared a simple meal in the kitchen, she began humming the melody that had always calmed Oliver. Within minutes, Oliver appeared in the doorway, drawn by the familiar sound. Charles watched as Grace and Oliver fell back into their natural rhythm. She handed Oliver wooden spoons to tap against the counter while she cooked, creating the percussion patterns he loved. Oliver giggled when she made silly faces while stirring the pasta, and he spontaneously hugged her legs when she bent down to check something in the oven. What struck Charles most powerfully was how effortless it all seemed. Grace wasn't following a behavioral plan or implementing therapeutic strategies. She was simply being present with Oliver, responding to his needs with intuition and care. Charles realized that all his expensive specialists and certified professionals had been trying to change Oliver to fit the world, while Grace had been helping the world make sense to Oliver. After dinner, as they sat in the living room, Charles did something he had never done before. He asked Grace to teach him. Not how to manage Oliver's behavior or implement treatment protocols, but how to see the world through Oliver's eyes. Grace was surprised by the request, but she could see the genuine desire to learn in Charles's expression. Grace explained that Oliver's behaviors weren't random or defiant. His hand flapping helped him regulate overwhelming sensory input. His need for routine provided security in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. His difficulty with eye contact wasn't rudeness, but a way of protecting himself from emotional overload. Grace helped Charles understand that Oliver wasn't broken or damaged. He was different, and different didn't mean less than. Over the following weeks, Charles began the hardest and most important work of his life. He started attending the therapy sessions with Oliver, not as an observer but as a participant. He learned about sensory processing and emotional regulation. He practiced patience when Oliver had meltdowns, offering comfort instead of trying to stop the behavior. He discovered that being a good father to Oliver meant unlearning everything he thought he knew about control and success. Grace returned to work at the penthouse, but in a completely different capacity. Charles created a new position for her as Oliver's family coordinator, with a salary that reflected the true value of her contribution. More importantly, he paid for Zoe's summer program and set up an education fund that would cover her college tuition and expenses. Grace was initially reluctant to accept what felt like charity, but Charles helped her understand that it wasn't charity at all. He explained that Grace had given Oliver something priceless, something that no amount of money could buy. The education fund wasn't a gift, it was recognition of value already provided. Grace had saved Oliver, and in doing so, she had saved Charles too. The transformation in Oliver was remarkable, but it wasn't instant or magical. There were still difficult days, still meltdowns and challenges. But now Oliver had two adults who understood him, who worked together to support him, who saw his autism not as a problem to be solved but as a different way of experiencing the world. The breakthrough moment came 3 months after that terrible night in the hospital. Charles and Grace were in the living room with Oliver, working on a puzzle together. Oliver had been quiet for most of the afternoon, absorbed in arranging the pieces by color and pattern. Suddenly, he looked up at Charles and spoke his first clear words in months. "Daddy, sing." Charles felt his heart stop. Oliver wanted him to sing, wanted to include him in the musical connection that had been exclusively Grace's domain. With shaking hands, Charles sat down at the piano and began playing the simple melody he had heard Grace play so many times. Oliver climbed onto the bench beside him, just as he had with Grace months before. Grace watched from across the room as father and son made music together. Oliver guided Charles's hands to different keys, creating harmony and rhythm. Charles sang softly, his voice rough with emotion, while Oliver hummed along in his own unique way. It wasn't perfect or polished, but it was real. It was a connection. It was love. When the song ended, Oliver looked directly into his father's eyes and said, "I love you, Daddy." Charles started crying right there at the piano bench, not caring that tears were streaming down his face in front of Grace and Oliver. These were the first words of love his son had ever spoken to him, and they came not because Charles had finally learned to control or manage Oliver's autism, but because he had learned to accept and celebrate it. Sarah's custody threats evaporated when she saw the change in both Charles and Oliver. During her next visit, she found a home filled with laughter and music instead of tension and chaos. She saw Charles on the floor with Oliver, building elaborate block towers and celebrating when Oliver knocked them down. She saw Grace treating Oliver not as a patient but as a beloved child, and she saw Oliver responding with joy and trust. Most importantly, Sarah saw that Oliver was happy. Genuinely, authentically happy in a way she had never seen before. The custody battle that had seemed so urgent suddenly felt irrelevant. Oliver was exactly where he needed to be. Grace's life transformed as well. With stable employment and financial security, she was able to reduce her other jobs and focus on her work with Oliver. Zoe thrived in her summer program and began planning for college applications with excitement rather than worry. For the first time in years, Grace could breathe, could dream, could imagine a future that didn't involve constant struggle and exhaustion. But the most profound change was in Charles himself. The man who had built an empire on control and efficiency discovered that the most important things in life couldn't be managed or optimized. Love requires vulnerability. Connection required presence. Being a good father meant being willing to learn from your child instead of just trying to teach them. Charles restructured his entire company around family-friendly policies. He implemented generous parental leave, on-site childcare, and support programs for employees with special needs children. He established the Oliver Foundation, with Grace as its director, dedicated to supporting families affected by autism and providing resources for children who needed alternative approaches to learning and development. The Foundation's first initiative was a scholarship program for educational professionals like Grace, who had natural gifts for working with special needs children but lacked formal credentials. Charles realized that the most effective autism support often came not from textbooks and certificates, but from people who could see beyond the diagnosis to the child underneath. 1 year after that terrible night in the hospital, the Whitmore family looked completely different. Charles had learned to be present, to listen, to follow Oliver's lead instead of trying to direct every moment. Oliver was thriving, speaking more each day, his personality emerging as his world became safer and more predictable. Grace had become more than an employee, she had become family in the truest sense of the word. The final scene of this transformation took place on Oliver's 9th birthday. The party was small, just family and a few close friends who understood Oliver's needs. There were no overwhelming decorations or loud music, just gentle celebration with people who loved him. As Oliver opened his presents, surrounded by the adults who had learned to see the world through his eyes, Charles felt a peace he had never experienced before. He looked at Grace, who was helping Oliver unwrap a new puzzle, and he looked at his son, who was stimming happily with excitement, and he realized that this was what success actually looked like. Not billions in the bank or companies conquered, but a child who felt safe enough to be himself, a woman whose gifts were finally recognized and valued, and a man who had learned that the greatest strength was admitting you didn't have all the answers. Oliver looked up from his presents and spoke clearly to the room, "Thank you for seeing me." At that moment, everyone understood that Oliver wasn't just thanking them for the birthday gifts. He was thanking them for seeing him not as a collection of symptoms or behaviors to be managed, but as a whole person worthy of love, respect, and understanding. Sometimes the person who saves your child is the one who saves you. And sometimes, the greatest privilege is learning to see people for who they truly are, not who we think they should be. Love doesn't require perfection. It requires presence, patience, and the willingness to learn something new every single day. Charles Whitmore had built an empire, but Grace Williams had built something far more valuable. She had built a bridge between a father and son, a connection that would last a lifetime, and a family defined not by blood or law, but by the choice to show up for each other every single day. The billionaire had learned that the greatest fortune isn't what you accumulate, but what you're willing to give away. And what he gave away, his pride and control and need to be right, he got back tenfold in love, connection, and the joy of watching his son thrive. This is what transformation looks like. Not perfect, not instant, but real and lasting and beautiful in its imperfection. A family born not from traditional structures, but from the radical decision to choose love over fear, understanding over judgment, and connection over control. If this story moved you, if it changed how you think about family, love, or what really matters in life, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. The world needs more Grace Williams and more Charles Whitmores who are willing to learn. What's the most important lesson you learned from Oliver, Charles, and Grace's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because every story of transformation begins with someone willing to see the world differently.